This is Lesson 25-2, Waging Total War. How did the First World War differ from other wars? And this is just a quick kind of introduction and overview to World War I for us. There's a couple of other lessons about World War I. And we've got College Board Topic 8.2, World War I, explain the causes and effects of World War I. We got into that last time, and we're going to have a little bit of a review of that, just a recap of some of it this time. World War I, caused by a complex interaction of long and short-term factors, resulted in immense losses and disruptions for both victors and vanquished. We're going to see that a couple of times. A variety of factors, including nationalism, military plans, the alliance system, and imperial competition, turned a regional dispute in the Balkans into World War I. And then with this other part of College Board Topic 8.2, explain how new technology altered the conduct of World War I. We're really going to see that here. New technologies confounded traditional military strategies and led to trench warfare and massive troop losses. Explain how the developments of World War I changed political and diplomatic interactions between and among nations. War in Europe quickly spread to non-European theaters, transforming the war into a global conflict. We'll see that. So the place is Europe, 1914 to 1919. Key concepts of waging total war. And we've got four things that are all related to each other in some way. Total war, the war of attrition, unrestricted submarine warfare, and trench warfare. And in the middle, we've got the Zimmermann telegram. First, let's talk total war. What is it? What total war is depends on what particular aspect of a war society you're talking about. There are four aspects of total war that we should be aware of. First, total war on the battlefront. This involves lengthy, deadly battles, using all possible weapons at one's disposal, and weapons that are mass-produced by an industrialized society. Then there's total war on the home front. That involves gearing and retooling a country's entire economy for war production. Factories, the rationing of consumer goods, the selling of war bonds, and lots of sacrifice. Then there's total war on civil liberties. These include things like censorship, ethnic prejudice, sedition and espionage acts, brutal occupation, and genocide. And finally, there's total war in the mind, propaganda, and war hysteria. As we've already seen, and this is just a repeat, from 1870 to 1914, the growth of main militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism greatly increased tensions among European nations. Nationalism among Slavs in the Balkans led to the assassination of Austrian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914. The conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary triggered alliances that started World War I. And here's a very famous cartoon which illustrates how these alliances pulled countries into World War I. It begins with Serbia on the lower left, little Serbia, and he's saying, if you touch me, I'll. And here's Austria with his hand on Serbia's arm and a fist raised. If you make a move, I'll. And then here comes Russia behind with his arm on Austria's collar and his fist raised. And he's saying, if you hit that little feller, I'll. And of course, Russia and Serbia are allies. And then here comes Germany with a spiked helmet. If you strike my friend, I'll. And of course, Germany and Austria are allies. And here comes an ally of Russia. If you hit him, I'll. And that's France. And then coming up behind, hi there. If you don't, and that's England. Europe before the war. And then Europe at the outbreak of the war. And you've got the Central Powers in purple. And you've got the Allied powers in green. So the Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria is also going to join the Central Powers. And then you've got the Allied powers in green, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and of course Serbia, where the war all started. When the war began in August 1914, Europeans were enthusiastic about fighting. And most people anticipated that the war would be over by Christmas 1914, and boy, were they wrong. And you can see here on the left, French recruits, they're smiling. They're happy to be going off to war. They think they're going to win easily. And then here are these German recruits on this train, and you've got all this writing here on the train. Ausflug nach Paris means it's an excursion to Paris. Auf Wiedersehen, auf dem Boulevard. We'll see each other again on the French Boulevard right there. And then to the right here, it says, there's something I can't read, and it says, into the fight. The point of my saber is itching. And so they have no idea what they're in for. When the war began, Germany's biggest fear was the potential of fighting a war on two fronts at the same time and having to split their forces. And they had dreaded this possibility literally for decades. Germany's solution was what was called the Schlieffen Plan, and that plan had been in development for a long time, and it involved quickly defeating France in the west first, and then sending troops to the east before Russia could fully mobilize for war. Stalemate and slaughter on the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan began with Belgium. The idea was to envelop Paris from the north by going through Belgium. The Belgian army, though overwhelmed, did not embarrass themselves. Their plan was to buy enough time for the English and the French to get organized, and they retreated in a slow and orderly fashion. But the Germans dealt harshly with the Belgian civilians and even burned the town of Louvain. At first, when the war started, the Schlieffen Plan seemed to be working when the German army marched through Belgium and France and got within a few miles of Paris. But English, Belgian, and French troops managed to stop them, and they saved Paris at the Battle of the Marne. And you can see the Marne River right there north of Paris. Meanwhile, Russia mobilized faster than expected, so Germany had to divert troops from their French campaign. Because the Schlieffen Plan failed and fell short and was stopped, the Central Powers were forced to fight a two-front war for the next 4 years. The fighting between Germany and France was known as the Western Front. And then the fighting between the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against Russia was known as the Eastern Front. By 1915, the war settled into a stalemate as each side fortified their positions with trenches. And here is an illustration of trench warfare. And the most important thing about this picture here is you've got the trenches on one side and you've got the enemy trenches on the other side here, and you've got a whole network of trenches, actually. And in between the two enemies, you've got what was called a no man's land. And that no man's land was filled with all kinds of trash and destroyed equipment, dead bodies, puddles of disgusting, dirty water, mud, barbed wire. So you name it, it was just a terrible place to try to spend a few seconds. Here is a picture of soldiers going over the top. Soldiers had very little decent food, and what food they had was often attacked by rats. And these rats were the size of small rabbits and badgers because they had fed on the decomposing bodies of dead soldiers. Those trenches would fill up with water a lot of times, and that water was absolutely full of terrible bacteria, which could eat your feet away, and it was called trench foot. New weapons were invented to try to break this stalemate of trench warfare and somehow win the war. For example, machine guns. The machine gun had been around since the 1800s, but it developed very quickly during World War I. Machine guns, such as the one shown here, slaughtered attacking soldiers and prevented significant movement on the Western Front for 3 years. They also had long-range artillery as a way to try to overcome the stalemate of trench warfare. Tanks were another way to try to overcome this stalemate, to try to somehow get over the trench and break the lines. Airplanes and zeppelins were another way to break trench warfare, to get over the trench and do the enemy damage. Flamethrowers and grenade launchers, same thing. Poison gas. Both sides used poison gases that burned the eyes, the skin, and the lungs and killed thousands of troops. After World War I, most countries agreed to ban chemical warfare. And in fact, even Hitler never used gas on the battlefield. Submarines. They were another way to try to gain an advantage and win the war. Old school military commanders had a hard time adjusting to the new realities of trench warfare and new technologies. They tended to resort to the old methods that they had always used: heavy bombardment, followed by massive frontal assaults, and these old tactics were no longer effective against the trench. In total, the warring countries never gained more than 3 miles of territory. Millions of soldiers were killed and wounded by these new weapons for minuscule gains. So here is a list. Poison gas, you've got the machine gun, tanks, the submarines, and these were all pieces of new technology that made a huge difference in the war. Just look at the casualties. You've got military deaths in the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I all compared, and look at the casualty rate in World War I. New weapons killed soldiers more effectively. During World War I, 8.5 million soldiers died and 21 million were wounded. Here's a nice picture of some guys getting together. They're veterans. They were served in the war, and now they're posing for a picture, smiling, and everything looks really happy. Until you look at the picture more closely and realize that none of them have any legs. Their legs were all blown off in the war by these new weapons. No matter how badly they tried, no matter how many new weapons they tried, no matter how many people were killed, fighting on the Western Front slowed to a stalemate as neither side could gain an advantage. During the 10-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded. And then another 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of the Somme. So 4 main battles to keep in mind is the Battle of the Marne, the Battle of Ypres, that's spelled Y-P-R-E-S, you just call it Ypres, Verdun, and the Battle of the Somme. And the big takeaway here on this map is that almost no ground was gained of any significance. Despite the deaths, neither the Allies nor the Central Powers gained an advantage after these battles. The widening war. Unlike on the Western Front, Germany dominated on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Tannenberg in August of 1914 was a massive victory for Germany. They almost completely destroyed 2 big Russian armies. The Russian commander had to commit suicide in order to evade capture. And by 1915, 2.5 million Russians had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans occupied huge areas of the Russian Empire. However, the Schlieffen Plan was also a failure in the East, just as it was in the West. A major aspect of the Schlieffen Plan had been to eliminate the possibility of having to fight a Western front. That part had failed. But it was also supposed to allow Germany to concentrate on one enemy to the east, which it could defeat quickly. However, the Russians were still fighting. The Russians were also having much greater success against Germany's close ally, the Austro-Hungarian army. Germany wanted to turn the territories that they had occupied into permanent German possessions into which they could spread the German population. It's a misperception that this idea began with Hitler during the Nazi era. The idea of extending the ethnic German population eastward and displacing the Slavs who were already there goes back to World War I. Germany installed a 15,000-man bureaucracy to administer these territories. They viewed the local Slavs as mongrels and savages. They stole animals and crops from local farmers, and about 1/3 of the civilian population died. World War I was a disaster for Italy. Italy had been a member of the Triple Alliance since 1882. However, Italy refused to join the war on the grounds that its ally, Austria-Hungary, had been the aggressor. Then Italy switched sides and left the Central Powers and joined the Allies in 1915 in exchange for the promise of some Austrian territory. They suffered a huge loss against the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans at the Battle of Caporetto in October and November of 1917. Italy suffered about 300,000 dead, wounded, and captured. The Ottoman Empire joined Austria-Hungary and Germany in October 1914. The Ottoman government had severely oppressed its minority of Armenian Christians in 1909. Armenians in the Ottoman Empire welcomed the Russian army as liberators, and as a result, the Ottoman government did an ethnic cleansing job on the Armenians, force-marching them out into the desert. Over 1 million Armenians died of either starvation, murder, or disease. The Turkish government denies the Armenian genocide to this day. The 1915 Battle of Gallipoli serves as a great example of the widening war. This was a failed attempt to control the Dardanelles, the narrow passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and the Ottoman capital of Constantinople. The battle resulted in 300,000 Ottoman and 265,000 British casualties. More importantly, ANZAC, the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, played a big part in this tragic battle. Australians and New Zealanders memorialize the Battle of Gallipoli every April 25th, much the same way that we memorialize Pearl Harbor today. World War I extended deep into the Middle East. The British got the Arabs to rebel against their Ottoman rulers in 1916. The campaign was led by Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca. The British promised Hussein that they would support the establishment of an independent Arab state once the war was over. And Hussein managed to drive the Ottomans from the Arabian Peninsula with the help of T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. They defeated the Ottomans all the way north to the city of Damascus. After the Arab success, the British totally went back on their promise. Instead, they instituted the mandate system at the end of the war. Japan, at the request of the British, joined the Allies very early in August 1914. The British wanted them to take on the German Navy in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Japanese and the British lay siege to the German port of Tsingtao, modern Qingdao, in China, and captured it by November 1914. The Japanese took the German colony of Kaiser Wilhelmsland, that's northeastern New Guinea, and several nearby island groups. And these campaigns greatly expanded Japan's influence in China and the Pacific Ocean. Over 1 million colonial troops from Africa and Asia served in World War I. Twice that many also served as porters and built defenses. The Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army was struggling to hold on against the German military. Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of Europe, and they failed to produce enough weapons or enough food. And here's a picture of Russian women training for combat. Millions of Russian soldiers and civilians died in the war. Not thousands, millions. By 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. The stalemate on the Western and Eastern fronts turned World War I into what we call a war of attrition, in which each side tried to outproduce and outlast the enemy. Whoever breaks first loses. Nations committed to what we call total war in order to win. In total war, factories were converted to make war equipment. Industrial resources were rationed in order to prioritize military needs. Governments used conscription to draft civilians into the military. Propaganda was used to maintain civilian support for the war. And overseas colonies were used to gain resources and additional soldiers. Let's look at this map and see how World War I impacted the whole planet. The main fighting of the war occurs in the western and eastern fronts of Europe. But the war also raged in Southeast Asia as Arab nationalists battled their Turkish rulers, the Ottoman Empire, one of the Central Powers. Japan declared war on Germany in 1914 and seized German colonies in China and in the Pacific. India provided about 1.3 million men to fight and labor alongside their British rulers throughout Europe. Both Austria and New Zealand fought on the side of the Allies and contributed many troops to the 1915 Gallipoli campaign in Southwest Asia. European colonies throughout Africa became a battlefield as warring parties struck at one another's colonial possessions. In South America, Brazil was the only South American country to enter the war, supporting the Allies with warships and personnel. And finally, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. Here's a picture of the Turkish cavalry. You have Sikh British soldiers in India, Chinese soldiers even. And here is a list of the Allies and the Central Powers during World War I. And you can see the Allies enjoyed a great superiority. To keep Germany from trading with other nations, Britain used its powerful navy to blockade Europe. Germany responded by using what we call unrestricted submarine warfare to attack the British Navy and any merchant ships that they thought was supplying the Allies with anything for the war effort. And that's why we call this unrestricted submarine warfare, because these submarines made no distinctions between battleships and passenger ships or cargo ships. And you can see the damage that they did. Each one of these dots represents a ship sunk by a German submarine between 1915 and 1917. German U-boat attacks, and a U-boat is simply the German word for submarine, played a role in bringing the United States into World War I. When World War I began in 1914, the United States remained neutral, but the USA was pulled into the war by 1917. As a neutral nation, the USA was trading with the Allies during the war. But Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare led to attacks on U.S. merchant ships and British passenger ships. President Woodrow Wilson demanded freedom of the seas, but Germany flatly refused. Americans were outraged in May 1915 when a German U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, killing 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. However, let's not overstate this. The United States still didn't enter the war for another 2 years. America's anger with Germany increased in 1917 after the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. Germany knew that U-boat attacks would eventually bring the USA into the war. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico proposing that Mexico attack the USA in exchange for the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Mexico declined the offer, and Americans were outraged. On April 2, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and entered the war. The arrival of millions of American soldiers in 1918 gave a boost to the Allies, and it was just in time because in November 1917, Russia signed a peace treaty with Germany and exited the war. By 1918, the Central Powers were running out of supplies, and they tried a massive attack into France. But the Allies halted the attack and pushed back. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered in October 1918. On November 11, 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, and World War I, at least the shooting part, finally came to an end. Military deaths in World War I. Nearly 10 million Allied and Central Powers soldiers died in the war. New weapons such as machine guns, mustard gas, and tanks greatly increased the casualties.